Well, welcome everyone. It's certainly wonderful to see so many people here this morning to engage in this conversation about a really critical issue around, a question that many people ask in the sector, but more broadly in community, which is, why doesn't she just leave? So when women are victims of family violence, domestic abuse, it's such a common question. Why doesn't she just leave? And I think the answer, from my experience anyway, being part of looking at providing support services and interventions across the breadth of programs for women who are victims of family violence and their children, it's very much far from a very straightforward answer, and it's quite complex. And that's what we're here to explore today with the wonderful panelists that Tim has just introduced to you. The format is about a 20-minute discussion with the panelists on a number of key questions. We'll then open up the floor to questions. So please, feel free to make notes around what questions you might want to pose at the end of the conversation. Also, there is paper being passed around that if people want to write a question, pass it on to me to pose to the panelists. I'm happy to do that. So let's get started. So a lot of women are scared in their own home. The fear is caused by the person that they love. They're anxious, they're confused, they're deflated from the years of abuse that they've endured. They know in their hearts that they might need to flee because their lives are actually at threat, and particularly the lives of their children. But where do they go? Does anyone want to start on that question? What are the options that women have open to them when they're in those situations?
I guess because I have the microphone.
Yeah, you can start.
The microphone to me. Thank you all for coming. So when you think about family violence and we talk about women fleeing, I think we need to just take a step back sometimes and reflect the context within which that woman may be existing. So let's look at the intersectionalities, so the cultural norms. And I will give, I'm from Cameroon, and I've got a type of a background around the whole African context in particular. So I will really talk maybe from the migrant woman's background, but also from that type of a cult perspective. So for example, you have a young woman who wants to leave or an older woman who wants to leave. She may never have earned an income of her own. And when we talk about income, we're talking about not going out there to work in a job that actually pays. But also, she is within a society or within a context that she's perceived as a property of somebody. So you've got these ingrained social norms that people and women are socialized to think they are properties, but the men also see them as their property. And the parents, for example, that woman got married early for a particular reason, because most often than not, they're married off early. Where is she gonna return to? Yes, when she comes back home for a few days, she will be received. But then after 3 or 4 days, they'll say, oh, when are you going back to your husband? So you have those social norms when if she doesn't have property. And these are some of the things that we really have to think about the context within the woman exists, rather than just thinking that, oh, she has to live. If you don't have money, if you don't have a job, how are you gonna live and how are you gonna support yourself? I'll leave it at that for now. So
Thank you. Obviously a very complex range of contextual things that come into play. Deborah?
Yeah, hi. I agree with all of that, but I think it's also important to look at it within the cycle of violence, because we know that the figures tell us that it takes a woman on average 7 attempts to leave before she leaves finally. And so when she finally does leave, if she manages to finally leave, you need to look at it within this context. It's not only the context of that it takes 7 attempts on average to leave, but also within the cycle of violence. And the fact that in the back of her mind is the fact that she's married this guy or living with this guy who promised to love her, to be with her, to support her, to cherish her, all of those wonderful things. And yet this guy has turned into a bully, a perpetrator of abuse, might be someone who perpetrates sexual violence as well, all these horrific things that are so much anathema to what she thought she was getting into, and the complete opposite to what she thought she was getting into. So on the one hand, she looks in front of her and she sees someone she might in her own mind call a monster. On the other hand, she also sees the guy she married, the guy she loved, or the guy she's living with, her partner. And she's got this conflict in her own mind. What do I do? How do I deal with this? Because the studies also tell us that most women don't actually want the relationship to end, they want the violence to end. So that's when they get sucked into the cycle of violence. And it's the old thing, the abuse, there's the build-up, there's the abuse, there's the apology, darling, I'll never do it again, please don't leave me, please forgive me. And she says, okay, and then it's okay for a while, the honeymoon period, and then it starts again. So when she actually finally makes the decision, it's enormously courageous because she's gone through most probably years of this, and then she thinks, well, what am I going to do? And that's exactly what happens. And then, okay, she may or may not have a job. She may or may not be able to afford accommodation. Where's she going to live? Now, we're talking about cultural mores and cultural issues here. She wants to be in a place where her children can continue to attend the same schools. She doesn't say she's living in Broadmeadows. She doesn't want to go to Frankston because her family aren't going to be in Frankston. Her family are going to be in Broadmeadows. The schools are going to be in Broadmeadows. It doesn't matter which place you pick. If she's living in Frankston, she doesn't want to relocate to Broadmeadows either for those very same reasons. She's not going to have the support of her friends, of her family, any of those things. So those are I would say, the major reasons, the major cultural imperatives that impact upon women not leaving. If you're not talking about cultural imperatives, then it's much easier because you see women who do relocate from, say, Melbourne to Shepparton or where it might be. There's also the issue of the safe house. Now, a lot of migrant women are not going to be, comfortable in a safe house. For example, community where I come from, the Jewish community. Now, we've never been able to set up a safe house because of the cultural issues that I just talked about. Say a woman's living in Caulfield or one of the more Jewish areas, she's not going to want to relocate somewhere where her children can't continue to attend the same schools, where she doesn't have the synagogues nearby, the family support, all those things. And if she goes to a refuge, she says, well, I need kosher food. And the refuge look at her as if she's coming from Mars. What does all that mean? So that can be done, kosher food can be provided, cultural sensitivity training can be done, which the Jewish Task Force did. But even so, even if somebody says, yes, we can give you kosher food, we can give you things that will make you feel comfortable here, the chances of her actually going are very, very slim. And I think that's true. Doesn't matter which migrant community you come from. I think those same issues are true of all the migrant communities.
Thank you, Deborah. So obviously very interesting points raised there around the cultural context of the individual, the cultural overlays in terms of the importance of connection to family and the importance of women to be able to show that that their vulnerabilities are exposed to their family, and the importance of services and opportunities for women to be able to make decisions rather than be forced into leaving. Anything, are there other overlays?
Yeah, look, I agree with a lot of what Deborah and Mimmie was saying. However, there's also other factors. For example, there's the fear of the white man. Most of the service providers are predominantly Anglo-Celtic. They don't understand the cold religion, the cold sensitivities. Indigenous women are 35 times more likely to be hospitalised, and they are not, they're very reluctant to access these services. They'd rather keep it within their community, as a lot of other communities. And we know that family violence doesn't discriminate. It just goes across communities, faiths, socioeconomic backgrounds. So I can't say it's easier for one woman to leave than another. At the end of the day, it's hard for any woman to leave. And I guess the cycle of violence that Deborah was talking about, the woman always has hope. And this is one of the intimidating, coercive behaviour of the person that wants to exercise that power and control. There's the build-up phase, and then there's the honeymoon phase. Well, you know, there's the explosion, of course, but that honeymoon phase where he's showing a bit of remorse, doing a bit of some acts of kindness, and that woman is thinking, oh wow, he's going to change, she really feels sorry. But that is a deliberate set of behaviours that have been found to be quite uniform along the perpetrators predominantly. That cycle was studied, and you know, thousands of women were asked, and that cycle was there always, maybe not the same length of the honeymoon period. Sometimes there was no honeymoon period, and that intimidation and the explosions were happening more frequently. Sometimes a woman stayed because that's where she was safe. At least she knew where he was, what his actions were. She knew his pattern of behaviour, and that is the only way she could keep herself and her children safe. Unfortunate as it is, there's a huge stigma in the community, in our society, about a woman that's divorced, regardless of religion or no religion. And unfortunately, while the perpetrators are men, the women are not offering the support they can. You know, 1 in 3 women affected by family violence. You know someone. If you yourself aren't going through it, everyone knows someone that's either in it or being a victim. Being there to listen, looking out for the signs, showing them support. I sort of challenged Tim's plateauing of the police reports and the increase of the inTouch and Safe Steps statistics. And I'd say that the fear of the police, lack of trust, a lot of the women are bypassing the police and going direct to services, because at least they can access women. There's a preconception or a misunderstanding that the men are not going to be compassionate, or they hear horror stories of, you know, all it takes is one good cop to be the first contact of a policeman being brought in on the scene. If it's a compassionate one, someone that understands family violence, or that woman might actually take further steps. She will feel empowered. But if a man comes on, a policeman comes on, and at the end of the day, the police force are human, just like us, and they make mistakes. And there's racism and there's issues with every community. If that police officer that steps in her life and just looks at her in a way that, come on, are you serious? Or is that really true? Or I can't be bothered. Doesn't have to be by word of mouth. It could be just a look. It could be the body language. A lot of these migrant communities that are coming, they have a preconception of what authority is back from their country. And we've seen more often than not some police officers in blue doing the wrong thing. Now, will I blame the whole police force? Absolutely not, because a lot of them are trying to do a great service to women. It's about being aware that it is not an easy decision. A woman has left mentally about 30 or 35 times before she actually physically takes a step out of that house. Proper support can empower her, whether she chooses to stay or to leave. That choice is hers. She's been keeping herself safe. It's about us supporting her the best way we can.
So it sounds like, I mean, obviously a very, emotional, very challenging, very critical cycle that women go through, and the irrelevance and importance of appropriate structures, from the opportunity for women to report or to access services. Certainly from the experience of inTouch, I'm not sure if in the audience you're aware, but inTouch was established over 30 years ago as a response, a culturally relevant service response to women who found themselves in situations of family violence, who had nowhere else to go. So I guess the question there is then, have things changed over that period of time? Because it sounds, especially when you say, the statistic you quoted, and when you look at more formal statistics, you put 6 women in a room, at least one of them will have been a victim of family violence, and there's really damning statistics about the number of women whose lives are taken. And just to contextualise, before we move on to some more comments, in April this year, according to Counting Dead Women Australia, research of Destroy the Joint, 17 women had been killed in April. By June that was 21. In 2016, a total of 73 women were killed as a result of family violence in the home. So, given the discussion that we started off with, and that for many women, this is a really complex issue, and like you said, in their hearts and in their heads, they've left, multiple times. They may have made attempts to, to reach out to either a service or a family friend or someone independent to give them some sort of guidance or support. But it's a really deep emotional path that they have to navigate. How do they not make this about leaving? What are the issues, and about a life-threatening situation? What are the things that are open to women to be able to support them through this exceptionally challenging time? Mimmie?
Yeah, thanks, Faye. I'm going to just take a step back and go back to the previous question as well, and just also add some context into the whole cycle of abuse when it comes to leaving. Most often than not, the parents will say to the daughters, I have been beaten by your father so many times, and it is something that in the community you watch every other woman being beaten. So if you want to leave that relationship, who is going to support you? But also there is the culture that affirms. So for example, they just did a survey in Africa, and a significant survey. About 51% of women, this is attitudes, accept that it is okay for their husbands to beat them if they burn the dinner. Yep. If they go out without permission, if they don't care for the children. So when you have the society, but what was even worse in that research is that younger women actually think are actually accepting of such behaviors than older women. I know we may think about, is that because they're young and naive, or is that because they don't have the resources to live compared to maybe a woman who is 35 or 40, who's got the resources or maybe has the capability. So we have to really think about, what are the social norms that make it that women are affirming that it's okay. And as one of the committees described it, the husband's beating stick feels like butter. The butter for bread? So that is how the husband's beating stick feels like. And in a tribe from Cameroon where I also come from, beating their wives for the atone is known as, is almost like a sign of love. For such that, or to an extent, that if the women don't get beaten from that particular tribe, they feel that the husband doesn't care about them. So they let them do whatever. So it becomes, it's socialized and it's accepted. And to say, is it changing? Absolutely, it's changing in some of the communities and in some of the societies. But to one extent, yes, there has been a decline. But when you look at how it's changing, there is a pattern as well. It changes when women have more economic power. Mm-hmm. It changes when there is education. But also research has demonstrated that it is not just education, it's higher education, because no education, interestingly, and then higher education as in a degree, are the areas that we've seen changes, as opposed to primary and secondary school education. And that is where it's quite perplexing, because why is it that women who have finished primary school, because there's been all the emphasis, especially with the MDGs, in making sure that primary education should be free, essential, but that every girl should have access. Now does that push to secondary school, but the evidence is telling us in some of the communities that girls who have only finished primary and secondary school are more prone to family violence than girls with no education at all and women with higher education. So why is it that gap? So when we're talking about education as well, it is not just general education for everybody. Another reason in terms of where the change can be made outside of education and financial independence is the whole collective agency of women. For example, one of the things that is happening on the continent and in Africa is where they're talking a lot about human rights. And this decade is the decade of the African woman. I don't know how many people know about that. But in 2016, we also had the Year of Human Rights in Africa with specific reference to women's rights. And 2017 was focused on youth and harnessing youth dividend. Next year is going to have another theme. Last year, one of the things, in 2016 then, one of the things that some of the women did collectively, rural women, was to go and climb Mount Kilimanjaro to talk about their rights, their land rights, and the reason why they need to write. But what they did, 10 of them climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, another 250 waited at the bottom. And this was just not only to raise awareness, but it was to help them take the charter that they had put together in terms of their access to rights, land rights, to the African Union, which is the peak body. I don't know how many people know a lot about the African Union, but it's 55 countries. European Union is 27 countries. So that just gives you context about what the African Union and the power that they have got. So thinking therefore that if we want to empower these women, because you don't have to empower them, it's about giving them agency, it's about that collectiveness and women supporting other women. Unfortunately, when women leave, the first people to ostracize them often are women. And until those type of attitudes are changed, it is going to be difficult. But with education, I think we can change that.
So, Manal, I'm really interested, given your background, that was a great description of, how you, obviously economic power is important, education is important, but agency is more important. And, we heard examples internationally of, how it might happen in other jurisdictions or other areas. How do we do that in Australia? How do we do it in Victoria to give women that agency?
Whilst educated people, as we know, are also prone to being victims of family violence, education and role modelling, specifically about gender roles. The overwhelming research has found that family violence is caused because of gender inequality. And that goes back to day one of the patriarchal, misogynistic system that has been put in place to make women inferior. Whether you look at the church, you look at politics, you look at the social context, everything goes back to keeping a woman subjugated, sexified, objectified. And the way to tackle that is to tackle it at all levels. In the 20th century, we are still fighting for equal pay. Women are getting 25% less wages for the exact same job with the exact same qualifications. Why is that? Why are most women getting jobs, secretaries, nurses? Very few are in that CEO positions. It's because the system is designed against us. We as women have also been taught certain social norms. Women are out there to work, women are in the house being the housekeepers. Men are financially supportive, therefore we have to be obedient. As an Abrahamic faith, the continuum of the Judaism, Christianity, Islam, God does not ask for oppression. God says, is my earth not big enough to leave oppression? And if you see oppression, it is the job of every single person to help a person that's oppressed. That's what predominantly religion offers. So I'd say that on an individual level, we all have a role to play. We bring up our children. Let's break that cycle. I know how my mum brought me up. Girls are inferior to boys. The boys could go out and do sports. The boys can go out, and girls. If I had a smaller curfew, or I had to be home by 10. Others would, my brother could come home at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. So it's up to us to break that cycle. We are teaching the boys of tomorrow.
Yeah.
Role modelling that relationship, healthy relationships, teaching it at school, at primary school level. What is a healthy way to communicate? Having institutions that try and have 50-50, females and males on board as board members. And we see that happening now, so there is hope. I believe in hope. And the government is doing all it can by injecting money into this epidemic. 657 calls a day, reports a day for the police on family violence issues. Biggest issue that's being tackled by the police force. inTouch, Safe Steps, inundated, everyone's trying to do what they can, but I believe with the funding, government has to take accountability as to who gets that funding and what are they doing with it. I see so many women, I guess homelessness, is it 33% of women are due to, 36% are due to family violence situations. So a woman thinks, well, if I leave, my parents, my family, my friends can take me in for a week, 2, maybe a month. What am I going to do after that? Where am I going to go?
So obviously, gender equity, which you raised, is a huge issue and an underpinning and an overlay on the issues we've been discussing so far. You lead into a really good point around homelessness. Is that why, from a legal perspective, Deborah, women stay because they don't have any choice in terms of, the perpetrators perhaps potentially being asked to leave the home rather than them?
Okay, I want to take it back a step. Firstly, I want to commend the police, Christine Nixon and then Ken Lay, who were, 2 of them were really instrumental, pardon me, in changing the culture of the police towards family violence. When I first started practicing law and when intervention orders first came in a bit over 20 years ago, the typical police response to an allegation of family violence to be called out, just another domestic. And that was really what they said. Oh, just another domestic, we've been there 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 10 times. She always says the same thing, but she never does anything about it. And that was the typical police response. These days, things have changed a lot, and that's, thankfully, most often not the typical police response. And that's largely due to the education of the police force. And, strength to their arm, because they've done a tremendous job in educating their members. Some people say the pendulum's gone a bit too far, but in terms of obtaining intervention orders, some people say, oh well, all the woman has to do is say anything happened. I'm playing devil's advocate here, but I'm going to come back to your question. So they say, oh well, they're used to manipulate the family law system in order to get somebody out of the house because they allege there's been family violence. They might have an intervention order, therefore he has to go. In some cases, it has to be said, in some cases that's true. They are manipulated. But I don't know what the percentage will be, but, like thumbnail size, very, very small. The overwhelming majority of people who apply for an intervention order have very good grounds to do so, extremely good grounds to do so. And many of those people, come time when it's about to expire, are shaking in their shoes because they don't know what's going to happen when it expires. Is the perpetrator going to come back? Do they need to try and get it extended? What are they going to do? How does the court system respond? In some cases very well, in some cases not so well, I would have to say. There has been an attitude, up until recently, I would say there's been a fairly strong attitude within the family law system to ensure that there is what used to be called contact, it's not called that now, but still call it that, contact between a father and the children, even though he's a perpetrator of abuse. Now, in many cases that might be supervised by one of the many contact services that are around, or it might not be supervised, it might be, say, daytime only. I think now there's beginning to be a change, and it may well be that the investigation into the family law system will bring this more than before, that time between children and the father who's the perpetrator is not in their best interest. Because it used to be, the court would say, oh well, he was only violent to her, he's only violent to you, but you're all the children, and he was never violent to the children. And they wouldn't take into account the effect of the children on the violence, because the children always knew. Children always knew what was going on, but this just wasn't taken into account by the courts. As I said, I think now that's beginning to change, but slowly. So I also want to endorse what Manal said, because women, what can they do, as she said? You know, I can go to my mother, my sister, my brother, my friend for a week, a day, a month maybe, then what? Then what do I do? In terms of obtaining emergency housing, few and far between, it's very hard to get, very hard to keep. And people play the financial game. I've had many cases involving family violence. I would say the majority of my work is involving family violence. Some of those cases involve rape. I've had a case recently where the woman was forced to go to swingers parties. Now I've had cases where all the money is held by the father or by the husband. She can't get access to money. She's stuck in squalid accommodation while he, in some cases, living the high life. And it's very hard to completely change the system. Now, it might be that things will change, but and there are things you can do in order to try and remedy that to some extent. But I think that the women know what they need to do, and I think the work has to be done outside. You know, the good question is, it's not why doesn't she leave, it's why does he abuse her? And the question is, why aren't there more men here? There are men who stand up. White Ribbon Day's caught quite a bit of flack, but there are men who stand up. There are men who are on the board of Safe Steps. There are men who are standing up. But there need to be more men. There need to be more men who say, I don't like that joke you made because it's sexist. I don't like that joke you made because it's demeaning. I don't like the fact that you're saying to your wife, where are the wine glasses? Well, if you're a wine drinker, always this, always that. You've got two legs. You can get whatever it is that you think's missing on the table. You know, the water glasses, whatever it is. You can do it. And I think that's where the conversation needs to go.
So that's a great lead-in into the last question I wanted to pose before we open up to the floor. I've got lots of questions here to get through, but you know, it is, should we be flipping that rather than why doesn't she leave, of how much more appropriate can our support systems be for women and children to keep them safe, and how do we hold perpetrators accountable, and you know, obviously we've discussed and explored, and you know, in discussions like this, there's never enough time because there's so much to consider. But issues of coercion and control, and women not, you know, having their independence eroded and their confidence eroded. But with the focus of the Royal Commission, particularly in Victoria, and the government in Victoria's commitment to shifting that and changing what is the biggest social concern in our community at the current time, you know, what are some of the, what does it look like, you know, at the end of this journey, when we've put in place legislative reform, you know, we understand where we need to go because of the underpinning of research that, you know, actually determines an evidence base for the size of the problem, but the impact of solutions, and, you know, how does that look in 10, 20 years' time? Will society change?
So what is the specific question?
Well, the question is, where to from here? How do we shift this? How do we shift this for women so that rather than blaming the victim for not leaving, that we offer them the supports that they need?
Great. So I think there are so many ways that we can make changes. One, changing the language that we use when it comes to family violence. So, for example, we have to shift from saying she was raped to he raped her. So the blame is not on the victim. But we also have to look at our systems. How are the policies friendly to women? Or how are the systems women accessible and acceptable? One of the reasons that women don't maybe report it or they just accept it is because they say they will not be believed. And the research and there is evidence to underpin that. So if they go to this to the courts, they say it is the person who has money that wins. And most often than not, they are financially disadvantaged. So there are so many things that we need to change, but we don't just look at education, gender, we have to look at the underlying causes, the systemic causes that are embedded. We don't look at the tip of the iceberg because most often than not, solutions are focused on that. We should look at what is underneath the water. And most often than not, it's because the woman has no rights. They don't have land rights. We know that any woman and women that have land rights, there is evidence that they can earn income, and these women are much more likely to leave an abusive relationship because they know that their children are going to be safe. Because that is always one of the key things. Are the children going to be safe? And until we start thinking in those terms, just imagine that you are a photographer and you don't have a camera, right? You are a typist, but you don't have a typewriter or a computer. That is what most of the women around the world are. These women till the land, but they don't own the land. Most of the land, and we know that most economies, the income comes from the land. So those are some of the basic things, just handing them their rights, but also making them aware that they have the rights. Something that we've not also talked about is the whole rights of inheritance. Most women, they don't leave is because if you leave, you're going to lose your right to inheritance, and you don't have any social security in the future because your son is going to have the inheritance or your late husband's brother, etc. So we have to address all those issues first, then if we want to help women.
And they're very much global issues.
Absolutely.
I guess in an Australian context, and particularly in a Victorian context, what do you think some of the more positive things are that are potentially happening that can start to shift this conversation?
Well,
outcomes.
I'm very hopeful, again, with the government recommendations and with the reforms that and I'd say Victoria is leading with regards to the reforms and the changes that are happening on a global level. With regards to the hubs that are being built, the amount of service providers now that are run by women. We've got Berry Street, we've got, inTouch, we've got Safe Steps, we've got Salvation Army now providing a lot of, I guess they're the main leaders when it comes to homes. Government's taking an initiative with, is that Fair Go for the homeless? Giving women coming out of family violence priority with regards to community housing. There are a lot of positives coming out. It's going to be a trickle-down effect with regards to everyone coming on board with regards to cultural sensitivities. What does a woman need? All the intersectionalities, whether she's, what background she's from, whether she's Indigenous, whether she's disabled. There's so many layers of complexities. However, we're working together. It's a work in progress, and there is some hope at the end of the tunnel. With regards to men, I commend the two men that are in the room today. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see you here. That is already changed, because I've gone to a few of these and there's not one man. So really, let's give them an applause. Education is key, and modelling. We need more models.
I might open up to, because we've got a lot of questions, so if we make this final comment and then
I
I'll
just
ask
want to
you
say
a
one
question.
thing quickly, and that is in terms of education, I think it's vital that the community is educated, because there's still a perception with some people that, oh, I never touched her. I never, I'm not an abuser. I never laid a hand on her. They don't understand, or they don't want to understand, that it's all about power and control. They don't have to lay a hand. It's the psychological abuse, it's the financial abuse, it's the emotional abuse, it's the pet abuse, it's the spiritual abuse. So all of these things that are part of family violence, and until the community out there and the perpetrators understand that they're not going to get away with it. They can't get away with it because our community, and I mean our global community, has said enough is enough, no more.
And that's, yeah, so, yeah, go ahead.
I believe community leaders have a big role to play. From the Muslim perspective, the imams, our priests, I guess, they have a congregation every Friday. The message they can give to between 500 and 3,000 men on a weekly basis is quite intricate and quite deep. Coming from men to men, I think, is really, really powerful. So if we can shift the mind of the men, get a template that sort of tells and educates that all religion says no to violence, society says no to violence, and promotes equality of women, will go a long way.
So, thank you for the discussion. Before I open up to questions, just to, in terms of, I think what we've heard, some really, challenging discussion around how we redress a lot of the gender inequity that leads to women being disempowered, women not believing that they have a choice and that their lives can change and will change with the right supports and services. The role of education, both at an individual level and capacity, for social participation through economic participation and inclusion, but also the role of the law and academia in framing this, alongside the law of communications in terms of the community being educated around what is acceptable and what is not. So now, just to some questions. Can anyone on the panel speak to the degree of inclusion of information and support for, because we've talked a lot about women, LGBTQI more specifically, or men more specifically, in that context around being victims of violence?
I think it is really important that we recognize that, yes, family violence is a gendered crime, but that's because women are disproportionately affected compared to men. It doesn't exclude the fact that men are also affected. And I think there is a body of literature out there that provides evidence that there are men who have also been affected by
1 in 12 men.
1 in 12 men. So, but there's a body of literature that states that men are also affected. However, the reason we focus a lot on the role of women and family violence is because it's a gendered crime, because we know 1 woman dies a week in Australia, for example, as a result of family violence. So that is why, but it doesn't stop the fact that we acknowledge the role of that men are affected. There are also policies out there, and I think the way we treat family violence directed at women should also be the same. We should believe men. And some of the men, because we bring up the boys, for example, to say you are macho, you're strong, you're not supposed to cry when something happens. And what happens? The men die in silence. So we have to encourage the camaraderie, but the opportunity for men to be able to speak up and also to be believed. So yes, I think men need to be supported just as women are supported.
And how about other people, like LGBTIQ?
Well, I know there's a gay support line for victims of family violence.
So, and how about just from a legal perspective, are men observing intervention orders at a general level, or are they ignoring them? That's one of the questions.
I think the majority of people follow them. A lot of the breaches are text messages. They don't realise that sending a text is a breach of an order, and some of them will be relentless in breaching an order by continuously sending text messages. Oh, I sent a text. Well, 25 and 10 minutes. But probably overall, I don't know what the stats are, frankly, but overall, I think yes, they're being observed.
Okay. Maybe.
But sorry, just one.
Oh, sorry.
Thing. I should add, one of the big problems with breaches of intervention orders and with family violence now is the use of tracking devices. So a lot of women are finding they go to refuges and they're being tracked because loving dad will buy a toy for the kid and put some kind of tracking device in the toy. That's happening. People don't disable their location settings on their Facebook pages or on their phones so they can be tracked that way. One of the best pieces of advice you could ever give someone who's leaving is to A, get a new phone number, B, change all your passwords, C, disable any tracking and location settings on any, and don't go on social media. And if you do, make sure you have no location settings because that's one of the ways people are being tracked.
So very practical response to that question there, which is quite horrifying really to think that your life is still endangered or your children's life, and even after you make that very difficult decision to move on. Another question: what do you have to say about women staying together with partners in those situations for the sake of their children? Is there advice?
I'd say do not advise a woman to leave. The best thing you can do is advise a woman to give her support and let her have all the knowledge she needs to make that decision herself. The way to empower a woman, listen to her. Ask her, are you okay? If you feel there's something wrong, find that time and say, are you okay? Sometimes a woman is waiting, craving for that question, someone else to recognise that there's something not right. Someone is there to validate her. She might not open up the first time, but she'll know that you're there if she needs to come out and talk about it. And that's a huge step for any woman. Just to come out and say something is such a huge step for any woman in that situation. So sometimes I know women that choose to stay and have stayed for 18, 20 years for the sake of the children, because in their mind and how they were brought up, keeping the family together is the most important thing. They don't think about the psychological effects of the children because they haven't been taught that. They've seen what their mother and father had done. They go to the priest, they go to the imam, be the good wife. Well, what the heck is a good wife? Be patient. This is your destiny. This is your allotted, this man is what you've been given, so you have to endure for the rest of your life. These are things that are inculcated in a woman, and she's constantly struggling. It's just so hard emotionally as well to be, fighting yourself, your inner demons, and say, should I stay or should I go? Am I being selfish for thinking of myself and leaving? Don't the children count more? So a woman is grappling with that choice, and once she makes that choice, believe me, she's been put in a corner. And that's her survival mode, is to take that step and leave. And it doesn't stop, does it? The abuse doesn't stop. Sometimes it's still controlling.
That leads into another really interesting question, and maybe you can respond to this too. What options are there for victims who can't escape the perpetrator, even if they do leave their home because there's a shared workplace or it's a small, tight-knit community?
Sadly, that happens quite often. We see that especially in the Indigenous community, and sometimes the only way is to go to the isolated, remote, start again. That's how the system's designed at the moment. That's the truth, that's the reality. If she wants to stay safe, then services will try and get her as far removed as possible from that community because of the threat from family, from elders in the community that might betray that trust. Until there is an awareness of what family violence is and how dangerous it could be for that woman, the only way is to move her to another side of Victoria or wherever it is to keep her safe.
And how about a justice question? Are there successful avenues for transformative restorative justice?
I'm not an expert in restorative justice. It certainly is having quite a push by certain people. Former Attorney General Rod Hultz set up a Restorative Justice Centre at one of the universities, the name of which escapes me for a minute. From reading about it, I know it has had some success. Personally, I've never been part of it.
Can I just add to restorative justice? I think an example where we've seen restorative justice was in Rwanda, where post the genocide, the victims, or people were victims, the oppressors or the other side, they actually had to do something for that family. So for example, if they killed the breadwinner, and the breadwinner was the one who was responsible for not only feeding the family, but for providing accommodation, then you had the honor, or you were given the opportunity not just beg for forgiveness, but to continue to provide those services. In some cases, some had to build homes for the families as payment or as a sign of that they are very sorry for whatever crime that they permitted, as opposed to South Africa. There was reconciliation, but there was no restorative justice post-apartheid in South Africa. So yes, I think in certain contexts it does work, and it's definitely not in family violence, but I think it is a part that we should think about pursuing, because there is evidence that restorative justice doesn't only heal the person who has been affected, but it actually heals the perpetrator as well.
So we've got 10 minutes left in terms of questions, and I've got a lot of questions, which is great because of your interest. I'll try and get through as many as possible, but may I suggest in advance, apologies for not getting through all of them, but maybe you can ask directly to the panellists if you had a particular question that I wasn't able to get to. There have been men's behaviour change programs implemented. Is there evidence that this is reducing violence against women?
Absolutely, yes.
Yes, you said no.
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 Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'll disagree with Mimmie, and I'll let you have a switch. I spoke to quite a few people, but one of them is Danny Matiki, who is an ex-crime officer. He spoke to 10,000 men that have gone through, he's also an ex-police officer, he's gone through to some of the men's behavioural changes, and he said out of 10,000 men, 2 have changed their behaviour. And who did he ask? He asked the women that are in their lives. Now, it also depends on the people delivering the service. Who are the counsellors? Who are, have they been educated in what is culturally acceptable or not acceptable? Again, role modelling is intricate, and if we don't have service providers knowing how to deliver a service, how can we expect the perpetrator to be aware of his actions and say, I want change? And Danny suggested that there are 2 things that influence change in a man or in a perpetrator. So one would be, what is he aspiring for? What does he fear? It could be the fear of losing his children that prompt him to change. It could be, being shunned by his community. Sometimes the men aren't even aware that what they're doing is wrong because of the culture around them.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just add to that? And again, I disagree with you in that I think it depends on the context and the evidence. For example, there's also been research in South Africa, and in this case, it was clearly related to condom use, for example, because one of the things around HIV, sexually transmissible diseases, and also that leads to family violence is the whole of is sex that women do not actually consent to. And the evidence was, if boys and men were educated and supported, they changed their attitude, and such that this research is being replicated in different areas. So I think it depends on the context, the question, but also the society within which we are talking. And also it's interesting that the women were asked, not the men. I think the research should really include both the perpetrators and the victims.
So another interesting question. Often victims suffer PTSD with the addition of trauma. what's the best way to support women to recover, or a woman to recover, and work her way through, at the same time, a convoluted legal system? Complex question.
Just repeat it, Faye.
Sorry, okay. Often victims suffer PTSD with the addition of trauma. So what is the best way to support women to recover, especially given the complexities of, as they're going through this journey, that they're dealing with a very complex legal system at the same time?
I find that a lot of support,
Yeah.
a lot of support from family and friends goes a long way. Being there for them, listening to their story, believing them. Not having them to repeat their story over and over again to different services. And I guess this is one thing that is being implemented now, having hubs where the woman tells her story once and service providers get together in order to work out the best course of action for her without it necessarily having to repeat her story over and over again. Legal system's very challenging. Having lived experience myself, it is quite daunting to walk into that courthouse, let alone the courtroom, on your own. So if someone can go with her or him and be there as a support, that goes a long way. Counselling also helps. Sometimes she's too ashamed, I guess, to talk to family and friends. Offering counselling for her, giving her some numbers, looking after her children so she can navigate her way through the system. That is what I'd advise. And for her to know her options. A few years ago, no one offered me to sit in a private room in a courtroom that even existed, or that I could be on CT camera. No one offered that to me, and I think, oh my God, if I had known that, I didn't want to go through my community. Because it's not, again, the stigma of being a divorced woman.
So another question around an issue we addressed, the cycle of violence. How do you break it in families where parents are victims and they become abusers, and children think that it's normal to enter in a similar relationship as adults because that's all they know?
I think that education, support, but also engaging families. We really need to start thinking that when a woman enters into a marriage contract, most often than not, it's beyond just that man and that woman. We need to think about the families, and in those situations where they live within clans, we need to bring those people in. And it is absolutely critical that we educate those people around the woman, because sometimes the power is not in that woman to make the decision. She may really want to make the decision, but the forces that surround her, and if we can identify those forces that surround her and try to break the chains, but also empower them and really give them realistic and practical solutions, but also create opportunities, because maybe that woman is in that relationship, through her, they are supporting all these other people. So think about her living. So we really need to think about the context within the woman is existing within the relationship and look beyond her or the two partners. It is not necessarily nuclear. It is more complex than that.
I think another way of doing it is education towards children. Not only respect for relationships programs, which have some use, but also thinking outside the square of it. For example, last year we brought out a performance artist from Israel who gave a one-man show about a guy who was a perpetrator of family violence. And we took this into the schools, and it was remarkably effective because children, adolescents, saw a normal guy in a normal relationship, saw it deteriorate in how he became a perpetrator. There was an intervention order against him. He couldn't see the children. And watching that play out in front of them, it was incredibly effective. And if you think outside the box a bit and do things like that, it forces them to think in a different way.
And one question, I think two more questions. Okay. So and back to, I guess, the title of this morning's conversation, very pertinent question. Why is it that we always say she has to leave and live with the fear and the stress, while he will go on with his normal life? What are the consequences for him?
It comes back to that whole victim blaming rather than, blaming the perpetrator. And that is what I think I said something earlier, that we need to change the language, the way we frame the questions. So my example was, instead of saying that she was raped, we changed the language to he raped her. So the focus is on the perpetrator rather than on the victim. Another thing is we need to have a legal system that women can trust. But not just that they can trust, but have women within the system. And India is an example where, having more women, not only in school, but in positions where they were judging cases and where they were making decisions, it allowed more women to come forward because they knew that they were going to be able to talk to somebody who was in a little way going to be empathetic, but was also going to understand them. So think about the law, but also think about who the decision makers are, and also that education and trust.
Did you want to know? Okay. So final question around the role and responsibility of an employer around broaching a situation where they're aware that someone is experiencing family violence. We know that legislation has changed, to support people and culture in workplace, to support victims of violence. How should employers actually respond? Are there any tips you have?
Absolutely. Employers, peers, friends, neighbours, shopkeepers, whoever you may be, everyone has a role to play. If you notice a woman that you believe is enduring some sort of violence, approach her, talk to her, find the private moment, make sure it's a private area, get one of her friends to talk to her, but don't just leave it. Don't just be the bystander. Be an active upstander where you can at least say, are you okay? Again, that's the question you ask her, are you okay? Everyone has a responsibility, whether it's child abuse, whether it's violence against women, we all have a duty of care to each other.
So on that note, thank you for those comments. Any final closing thoughts?
From me, it would be good to see a day where women are going to have those attitudes where they don't see their husbands beating stick as butter. They actually reject it. And I believe that there's only one thing that can do that. Education, not only to the woman, but education to all the people that surround the women, and that includes our society, but also having a type of a collective approach and providing agency and voice, but also economic empowerment, because the evidence shows that most women don't live as a result of not being able to not only support themselves, but also most of them are the children involved in those relationships. Thanks.
I think the shame of leaving has to go away, and that you can't just wave a magic wand to make that happen. One of the things that we did, the Jewish Task Force did, was to educate rabbis. And working with other multi-faith groups, I've seen that's one of the most effective tools, whether it's the imam or the priest or the rabbi, whoever it is, when they stop saying, go back and be a good wife, but say, yes, I understand, I support you, I hear you, then we've come a long way, and I think a lot more work has to be done there, continue to be done there, because the effect that they have and the power that they have can't be underestimated.
Thank you.
My closing words would be hope.
Yeah.
Just the fact that everyone is here in this room today, that gives me a lot of hope that change is happening. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I want to thank our panellists. Join me in thanking our panellists for a great conversation and a lovely way to end this conversation, because I think we've heard a lot about the challenges of this issue and the heartbreaking outcomes of worst case scenario. But what a lovely comment to end on in terms of, I think, and I've observed in my time as chair at inTouch that, we do have the power collectively to change lives. I know we do that at inTouch, and I think that the message that is most important for us to leave with is that we all have a role to play to give hope to women who are victims of, and children who are victims of family violence. So I want to thank you all for your participation, and again just to note that if you have particular questions you want to put to any of the panellists individually, please feel free to do so. Thank you so much.
Thanks,